Let's dive into this, huh? The Skull and Bones, right? Yale's secret society. Lots of mystery surrounding this one.
Yeah, it seems like there's always something new to uncover with them.
For this deep dive, we're looking at a researcher named Mark. He's been doing a ton of digging into Skull and Bones. He hosts the podcast called My Family Thinks I'm Crazy. Pretty interesting stuff he's found.
I've heard some of his work. Definitely raises some eyebrows.
So our goal today is to really get into it, you know? Who are these Skull and Bones folks? What do they do? And most importantly, why should you care?
Sounds like a plan.
Yeah.
One of those things, you hear whispers about it, but never the full story.
Right. Like it's all very hush-hush, just 15 Yale juniors every year, always shrouded in secrecy. And their alumni list, whoa, we're talking 3 U.S. presidents, both Bushes included.
And tons of other heavy hitters in politics, business, media, you name it.
Which is why it's worth digging deeper. It's not just some college fraternity prank stuff. It's about power, concentrations of power, working behind the scenes.
Yeah, exactly. How much influence does this group really have? That's the question.
So let's back up a bit. Skull and Bones started back in 1832. The founders, William Huntington Russell and Alphonso Taft.
From that Taft family.
Yeah.
Politically powerful, going way back.
Gives you a sense of the kind of lineage involved here. And get this, the story goes that they got inspired by something they saw at the University of Berlin.
Adds to the mystique, right? No one knows for sure what it was.
Now, this is where it gets a little crazy. Mark claims there is a connection to the opium trade. Sounds out there at first, I know.
Yeah, opium, that's a big jump.
But he traces it back to William Huntington Russell's cousin. This guy, Samuel Russell, was knee-deep in the opium trade back in the 19th century.
I see where he's going with this.
Mark doesn't say Skull and Bones directly sold opium, but he questions whether their connections, their influence, maybe helped create the environment for a black market to flourish here in the U.S.
Interesting. He's implying they might have turned a blind eye or even benefited from it.
Potentially even targeting certain groups. He brings up immigrants and Native Americans.
Okay, now we're getting into some serious allegations. But is there evidence to back this up?
That's the million-dollar question. We know about Samuel Russell and his opium dealings. That's historical fact.
Right, but proving a direct link to Skull and Bones actions, that's another story.
We need more than just speculation, right? What specific policies are we talking about? Who are the players?
We need concrete evidence to separate fact from fiction here.
Okay, so setting aside the opium question for a moment, what about other theories on how Skull and Bones operate?
Well, there's this researcher, Anthony Sutton, who Mark talks about quite a bit. Sutton calls Skull and Bones a deep state organization.
Hold on, deep state. Sounds like we're in a spy thriller now.
Basically, it means there's this hidden network, people within the government, institutions, working behind the scenes, pulling the strings.
Regardless of who's officially in charge. So like a shadow government kind of thing.
Exactly. Sutton argues that Skull and Bones is intentionally placing its members in powerful groups. The Bilderberg Group, World Economic Forum, that kind of thing.
To push some hidden agenda, it's like something out of a conspiracy theory.
Right. But it's a theory that's been around for a while, and it's one that Mark seems to find compelling.
And he connects this back to how both political parties often seem to be moving in the same direction, even when they're supposedly opposed to each other.
It's like there's an invisible hand guiding them, pushing certain agendas forward, regardless of who's in office.
Makes you think, right? Like, is it all just a show for the public?
Even if we don't buy into the whole deep state conspiracy, the idea of such a small group having so much power is concerning.
No doubt. It raises questions about democracy, about who really holds the reins.
And whether those reins are being used to benefit the few at the expense of the many.
Okay, so we've got this potential opium connection, this deep state theory. But how do they even choose these 15 members every year? And how do they maintain secrecy for so long?
Well, Mark says their selection process has changed over time. It used to be all about family lineage, coming from wealth and power.
Makes sense, right? Old money, old connections.
But lately, it seems they've shifted to a more international focus.
International, so not just about American dominance anymore.
Apparently not. Mark thinks they're trying to connect powerful families from all over the world, East and West. He even mentions this Yale professor, Arthur Hadley Twining, who was buried in a full samurai suit.
What? A samurai suit? That's unusual.
Right. It suggests some kind of connection to Japan, maybe a fascination with Eastern power structures.
So they're casting a wider net, building a global network of influence. But how do they keep everyone quiet?
Mark points to their rituals, their infamous tomb headquarters, All very secretive, very exclusive.
Oh yeah, the tomb. I've heard all kinds of crazy stories about what goes on in there.
Supposedly, these rituals create a strong sense of belonging, of elitism,
Mm.
like they're entering a world within a world.
It's like they're being initiated into something much bigger than themselves. And that kind of psychological impact, combined with the potential social pressure and maybe even implied consequences, it could be a powerful deterrent to spilling the beans.
Definitely creates a strong incentive to keep your mouth shut.
Makes you wonder what kind of long-term impact it has on those individuals. Are they being molded into something specific? Do they even fully grasp what they're getting into?
Those are questions worth pondering as we dig deeper into this.
Right, because it's not just about the rituals and the secrecy. What about the real-world consequences of Skull and Bones' actions? How does Mark think they're impacting our lives?
That's where things get really interesting. He argues that their influence extends far beyond those 15 members each year. He believes they've had a hand in shaping things like the education system.
Wait, what? Our schools? How so?
He suggests that they might be pushing for a system that values obedience and conformity over critical thinking and creativity.
So basically, creating good little workers who won't question the status quo.
That's the idea. He points to the emphasis on standardized testing, rote memorization. Does that really foster genuine learning?
It's a bit disturbing to think that the way we're educated could be influenced by a group with its own agenda. But is there evidence to support that?
That's where we need specifics. What evidence does Mark present? Who are the key players? How do they exert their influence? Those are questions we need to explore.
Fair enough. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that there's some truth to this claim. What does Mark propose as an alternative?
He paints a very different picture of education, one that emphasizes creativity, critical thinking, genuine engagement with the world around us. He contrasts that with what he calls the manufactured, globalized world of mainstream entertainment.
So instead of getting swept up in the global currents, we should focus on creating something meaningful right where we are.
Exactly. Building strong local communities, fostering authentic connections. He sees that as a way to reclaim our power, create a more fulfilling way of life.
Sounds idealistic, but is it realistic?
That's what we need to figure out. Can we break free from these systems that might be trying to control us?
That's the big question, isn't it? And that's what we'll be exploring as we continue our deep dive.
So we were talking about alternatives, right?
Right.
How to counter these forces that Mark's describing.
Yeah, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by it all. Like, what can one person actually do about these global elites?
Well, Mark's not about fighting them head on. He thinks that's a losing battle. Instead, he says, focus on what you can control.
Makes sense. But how does understanding something like Skull and Bones, this elite group, how does that translate to making a difference in my everyday life?
He argues that by understanding their tactics, how they manipulate and control, we can start to recognize those same patterns playing out in our ODUN lives.
Okay, I'm listening. Give me an example.
He talks a lot about the media, how it amplifies fear and negativity, keeps us distracted, keeps us from taking action.
Yeah. It's true. You turn on the news, and it's all doom and gloom. But how do we know if it's deliberate or just, the nature of news to focus on the bad stuff?
That's the key, right? Developing that critical thinking. Mark says, question everything you consume, especially from mainstream sources.
Like, who owns those media outlets? What are their motivations?
Exactly. Are they pushing an agenda? Are they presenting a balanced perspective? We need to be media savvy.
Media literacy, right. Being able to decode the message, not just passively absorb it.
He also stresses seeking out alternative viewpoints, the voices that are often silenced or marginalized by the mainstream.
He actually draws a parallel to how he says Skull and Bones operates. Claims they push social movements to extremes, then use the backlash to discredit the whole thing.
He uses the woke movement as an example.
Right, like take a legitimate concern, blow it out of proportion, then use that to dismiss the whole issue.
Classic divide and conquer.
Yeah.
Pit different groups against each other, distract from the real problems.
So instead of falling into those traps, Mark says we should focus on building bridges, finding common ground.
Precisely. Connecting with people from diverse backgrounds, breaking down those barriers. That's how we build a more resilient society.
Makes sense. Unity over division, right. But he also says understanding local history is key to unraveling these larger global conspiracies.
Yeah, that one threw me for a loop at first. Like, what does my town's history have to do with Skull and Bones?
Right. It sounds like a stretch.
But his point is that the patterns of control, the manipulation, it's often mirrored at the local level.
So, by studying our own communities, we can gain insights into how power operates on a larger scale. It's like those Russian nesting dolls. You open one, and there's another one inside, and another.
Exactly. Start with what's familiar, what's right in front of you, then you can start to see the bigger picture.
So, instead of getting lost in these grand conspiracies, start local. Who holds power in your community? How did they get it? What are they doing with it?
Those are questions worth asking. It's about connecting the dots, seeing how it all fits together.
Okay, so we've got to be aware of manipulation, question everything, dig into our local history, anything else.
Mark's big on individual action. He talks about this thing called the 99th monkey effect.
I've heard of that. It's like when enough monkeys on an island learn a new skill, suddenly all the monkeys know it, even without being directly taught.
Right. Now, whether it's scientifically accurate or not, the point is that individual actions can create ripple effects.
So, if enough people reject these manipulative tactics, embrace a different way of thinking, that shift in consciousness can spread.
That's the idea, like a critical mass of awareness leading to real change.
Kind of like that Margaret Mead quote, right? Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world.
Exactly. Mark's message is ultimately one of empowerment. He believes that by making conscious choices, building strong communities, living authentically, we can create a better world.
It's inspiring, but it also feels like a lot of pressure. Like, am I doing enough? Am I making the right choices?
And this is where he brings in this Taoist monk he interviewed. The monk gave him some advice that really stuck with him.
Oh, I'm all ears. What did the monk say?
He said, live by example. Don't try to force your beliefs on others or get into arguments. Just focus on living in alignment with your own values and trust that people will follow your lead.
Powerful. It's not about preaching or lecturing, it's about walking the walk.
Exactly. Your actions will speak louder than words.
And that doesn't just apply to activism or social change. It's about everything, right? How we treat each other, how we live our lives.
Right. He even brings up something as simple as wearing shoes.
Shoes. What do shoes have to do with any of this?
He's not anti-shoes, but he uses them as an example of how modern conveniences can have unintended consequences.
Okay, go on.
He says that by constantly wearing shoes, we lose that direct contact with the earth, that grounding, that sensory feedback. It might seem like a small thing, but he thinks it contributes to a sense of disconnect.
Interesting. It's like we're always trying to cushion ourselves from the world, isolate ourselves from nature.
And he connects that to a larger trend of relying on external authorities instead of trusting our own bodies, our own senses.
So it's not about throwing away your shoes and walking barefoot everywhere, but about being mindful.
Exactly. Questioning our assumptions, recognizing the trade-offs we're making in the pursuit of comfort and convenience.
Makes you think, right? Like what other seemingly harmless habits might be contributing to this sense of disconnect?
He talks about food, about how processed foods lack the vitality and nutrients of whole, natural foods.
It's all connected, right? Our physical health, our mental health, our connection to the earth, our ability to think critically and make conscious choices.
He even throws in some observations about cultural differences between the East and West coasts.
Oh, the age-old rivalry, huh?
Yep.
Which coast is better?
Well, he says both coasts have their strengths and weaknesses. He observes that the East Coast has a stronger sense of community.
Interesting. Like more willingness to stand up to authority?
Maybe. He contrasts that with the West Coast, which he sees as more susceptible to trends, especially from the entertainment industry.
Yeah, the West Coast is all about image, consumerism, keeping up with the Joneses.
But he's quick to point out that both coasts are facing similar underlying problems.
Like what?
Corruption, greed on the part of those in power. He sees that as a root cause of a lot of the issues we're facing.
Yeah, sadly, that's not limited to one coast or one country. It's a human problem.
And he specifically calls out corrupt politicians, those who exploit vulnerable populations for their own gain.
It's disheartening, but it's important to call it out, to hold those in power accountable.
And that's where he circles back to education. He believes a true education should empower people to think critically, to question authority, to create a more just world.
Okay, but what does that look like? What kind of education are we talking about here?
That's something we need to dig into further. Does he offer specific models, or is it more of a broad vision?
Yeah, because it's easy to critique the existing system, but offering concrete alternatives is another thing altogether.
Right. But before we get to that, he throws in this whole tangent about language and ancient cultures.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. How does that fit in?
He starts by reminding us that most Western languages are Indo-European in origin.
Meaning they share a common ancestor with languages spoken in India and parts of the Middle East.
Exactly. It highlights our shared human heritage. And then he goes on to talk about these historical connections between Germany and India.
Like what? I'm drawing a blank here.
During World War I, Germany sent weapons to India to support their fight against British rule.
Wow, I never knew that. It's crazy how history is full of these hidden connections, these unexpected alliances.
Right. And it all ties back to this larger conversation about Skull and Bones and their alleged global ambitions. He also brings up this fascinating story about the German fascination with Eastern mysticism.
Like Hinduism.
Yeah, Hinduism, Buddhism. There was this whole movement in the early 20th century called Theosophy.
I've heard of that. It was all about blending Eastern and Western spiritual tradition.
Exactly. And Marx suggests that this German interest in Eastern mysticism might have actually contributed to their belief in Aryan supremacy.
Whoa, really? That's a surprising connection.
He specifically mentions the swastika, how it was originally a sacred symbol used in cultures all over the world, but then the Nazis appropriated it for their own twisted ideology.
It's a stark reminder that even spiritual teachings can be distorted and used to justify horrible things.
And it makes you wonder what other ancient symbols or teachings might have been manipulated throughout history.
Yeah, it's a sobering thought. We need to be discerning, to think critically about everything we encounter, even spiritual or esoteric teachings.
Agreed. But let's get back to World War II. Mark dives into some pretty wild stories about occult practices that were supposedly used during the war.
Wait, occult practices? Like what?
He talks about this magical duel that supposedly took place between Aleister Crowley, a famous British occultist, and one of Hitler's wizards.
A magical duel. Are you serious?
Yeah, apparently Hitler took this stuff very seriously. He believed it could give him an edge in the war.
It's a reminder that even in the midst of global conflict, the human fascination with the occult, with magic, it never really goes away.
Exactly. And then he brings it back to Yale. He points out that Yale actually played a controversial role in World War I.
How so?
They sent students to fight alongside the British even before the U.S. officially entered the war.
Wow, I had no idea. It's amazing how much history is hidden, how many secrets are buried beneath the surface.
And speaking of hidden agendas, he brings up this concept of manufactured chaos.
Okay, I've heard that term before, but what does it actually mean?
He believes that elites often create or exploit situations of chaos and unrest to justify increased control and surveillance.
So it's like problem, reaction, solution. You create the problem, people panic and demand a solution, and then you swoop in with the solution you had planned all along.
Exactly. And that solution usually involves more power for those in charge. He uses recent protests and riots as examples.
Like suggesting that some of them might have been intentionally instigated or manipulated?
That's his theory. He's not saying all protests are fake, but he's urging us to be discerning, to question the narratives we're being fed.
It's like, don't just blindly accept what you see on the news or social media. Do your own research. Think for yourself.
Exactly. Critical thinking is more crucial now than ever, especially with the way information spreads online.
Speaking of online, Mark also talks about the role of technology in all of this. He sees it as a double-edged sword.
Absolutely. It can be liberating, but it can also be a tool for control.
He specifically calls out social media, right? How it creates these echo chambers where we're only exposed to information that confirms our existing beliefs.
And it makes it harder to have meaningful conversations with people who hold different views.
It's like we're all trapped in our own little bubbles, becoming more and more polarized.
And that division benefits those in power.
Yeah.
It's harder to unite and challenge them when we're constantly fighting each other.
He also talks about how technology has made surveillance easier, right? Like, we're all leaving these digital trails wherever we go.
Exactly. Our phones, our computers, our smart devices, they're all collecting data on us, tracking our movements, monitoring our behavior.
So what's the solution? Do we all need to go off the grid and become Luddites?
Mark's not advocating for that. He recognizes the benefits of technology, but he urges us to be mindful, to choose platforms that prioritize privacy, to engage in face-to-face interactions whenever possible.
It's about using technology consciously and intentionally, not letting it control us.
Exactly. Reclaiming our digital sovereignty.
But even with all the technology in the world, it's human connection that really matters, right?
Absolutely. Mark emphasizes the importance of community, of building those authentic connections that can sustain us through these challenging times.
Because when you feel like you're fighting an uphill battle against these powerful forces, it's easy to feel isolated, powerless.
He contrasts that with the isolation and atomization that's so prevalent in modern society. He argues that it makes us more vulnerable to manipulation and control.
It's like that saying, united we stand, divided we fall.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
he encourages us to get involved in our local communities, to build relationships with our neighbors, to support organizations that are working to create a better world.
It's about taking action, not just sitting back and complaining. It's about creating the change we want to see, starting in our own backyards.
And this brings us to a really interesting point that Mark makes. He talks about the importance of tapping into our intuition and the subconscious mind.
Intuition, that gut feeling that tells us what's right even when we can't explain it logically.
Exactly. He believes that our intuition is connected to a deeper level of wisdom, a knowing that transcends our conscious mind.
But how do we tap into that? It can feel so elusive.
He offers some practical advice. Spend time in nature, meditate, journal, pay attention to your dreams. It's about quieting the mind, creating space for those intuitive nudges to come through.
Like learning to listen to that inner voice.
He also encourages us to pay attention to synchronicities, those meaningful coincidences that seem to pop up in our lives.
Like when you keep seeing the same number everywhere or you run into someone you were just thinking about.
Exactly. He believes those synchronicities are more than just random occurrences. They're messages from the universe, trying to guide us.
It's like the universe is speaking to us in a secret language, and we need to learn how to decipher it.
And this leads to another mind-bending concept that he explores, the nature of reality itself.
Okay, now we're getting deep.
He suggests that reality might not be as fixed and solid as we perceive it to be. He believes our thoughts, beliefs, and expectations actually shape our experience of reality.
I've heard of this concept called the law of attraction. The idea is that what you focus on, you attract. So if you focus on negativity, you'll attract more negativity. But if you focus on positivity and abundance, you'll attract more of those things.
Exactly. And Mark ties this back to the idea of reclaiming our power. He believes we're not just passive observers of our reality, but active creators of it.
So if we want to change the world, we have to start by changing our own thoughts and beliefs about what's possible.
That's a powerful message, isn't it? We have more control over our reality than we realize.
But it also comes with a lot of responsibility, right? If we're creating our own reality, then we're also responsible for the state of the world.
That's a great point. It's not about blaming ourselves for all the problems, but about recognizing that we have a role to play in creating solutions.
It's about taking responsibility for our own thoughts, beliefs, and actions, and recognizing that they have an impact on the world around us.
Exactly. And Mark emphasizes the importance of using that power for good, for creating a world that's more just, equitable, and sustainable. He believes that we're capable of achieving anything we set our minds to if we're willing to put in the effort and persevere.
It's about believing in ourselves, in our dreams,
Right.
having that faith that we can make a difference.
Exactly. And he encourages us to cultivate that sense of wonder, to appreciate the beauty and mystery of life. Never lose that childlike curiosity.
It's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day grind and forget to just be amazed by the world around us.
Right. Find joy in the simple things. Be present. Appreciate the magic that's everywhere if you just open your eyes to it.
I love that. It's like remembering to see the world through the eyes of a child again.
He also talks about how we're all connected, not just to each other, but to something bigger than ourselves.
Whether you call it God, the universe, source energy, whatever resonates with you.
Right. He believes there's this divine intelligence that flows through everything.
It's that feeling of oneness, of being part of something much greater than ourselves.
Exactly. And he encourages us to tap into that connection through prayer, meditation, spending time in nature, whatever works for you.
It's about nurturing our spiritual side, remembering that we're all part of something sacred, something interconnected.
He ends with this really powerful message of hope. He believes that even though things might seem chaotic right now, we're on the verge of a big shift, a global awakening.
It's like we're at a turning point in history, and we have the power to choose what kind of future we want to create.
Exactly. He encourages us to hold on to that hope, to be the change we want to see, and to trust that together we can create a better world.
It's inspiring, for sure,
Yeah.
but it also feels daunting sometimes. Like, where do we even begin?
Well, that's why we wanted to share Mark's research with you. It's about starting those conversations, raising awareness, and empowering people to take action.
So thinking back on everything we've discussed,
Yeah.
what are some key takeaways for our listeners?
Remember that knowledge is power. Understanding how these systems operate helps us make more informed choices.
And don't underestimate the power of individual action. Even small changes can create ripple effects.
Most importantly, remember that real change starts from within. Cultivate those qualities of resilience, gratitude, compassion.
Connect with your intuition, follow your heart, and trust that you have a unique role to play in this unfolding story.
This deep dive into the world of Skull and Bones has been a wild ride.
We've explored some pretty mind-blowing concepts, but ultimately it's a story about human potential, about our ability to choose love over fear, connection over division, and hope over despair.
It's been a pleasure diving deep with you.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.